Okay, we're up to Pei Gimel Amid Bey is the last 5 words. Just to review, the Mishnah had said that all karbanos have to come from Eretz Yisrael, but can come from either Chutz La'aretz or Eretz Yisrael. They can come from Chadash or Yashan. But the 2 karbanos that are the exception is the Omer and the Shtei Alechem. The Omer and the Shtei Alechem have to come from Chadash and from Eretz Yisrael. That was the Mishnah. So Omer and Shtei Alechem have to come from Chadash, and they have to come from Eretz Yisrael Dafka. Then the Gemara had started off by saying that there's a brisa that disagrees. The brisa says that the Omer and the Shtei Alechem can actually come from Yashan. B'diavad, l'chachila from Chadash, but b'diavad it's fine. Okay, so you have machlokes whether the Omer and Shtei Alechem can come from Yashan or not. Our Mishnah says no. The brisa says yes. Says the Gemara, ad kan li pligi ela b'chadash. The Gemara says ad kan li pligi ela b'chadash. The whole brisa disagrees with the Mishnah regarding Chadash and Yashan. That's where there's a machlokes. But regarding Eretz Yisrael, the brisa agrees that the Oim and the Shtei Alechem have to come from Eretz Yisrael. I mean, the whole shaila, the machlokes, the brisa and the Mishnah is whether the Oim and the Shtei Alechem can come from Yashan. But Chutz La'aretz, everyone agrees is no good. That's what it seems like, because even the brisa said Mamosh V'Seichem, it has to come from Eretz Yisrael. So the whole shaila in the brisa is Chadash and Yashan, but Chutz La'aretz is definitely out by the Omer and Shtei Alechem. Says the Gemara, Ava B'Eretz Lei Pligi, the Omer Shtei Alechem Eretz Im, the Chutz La'aretz Lei. Kiman, who is the author? Is Deloy Kaitana. We have a brisa that it disagrees with both. There's a brisa that holds that the Omer can actually come from Chutz La'aretz. The brisa says, Rav Yosi bar Rabbi Yehuda Omer ba mechutz la'aretz. The Omer can actually come from Chutz La'aretz. Now, it's a bit of a shaila. The reason being is because when the Omer is described in the Torah, it says ki savayu ala aretz. Ki savayu ala aretz definitely sounds like it's an Eretz Yisrael dika grain. Uman mekayim ki savayu ala aretz shlei neschayvu ba'omer kayim shenichus ala aretz. It doesn't mean the grain has to come from Eretz Yisrael. It means that Klal Yisrael did not begin doing the Omer until he entered Eretz Yisrael. Ki savayu ala aretz just means that the mitzvah only applies when Klal Yisrael was in Eretz Yisrael. They didn't do it in the Midbar. But once they entered Eretz Yisrael, they could bring it from Chutz La'aretz. The grain can be imported from Egypt or from Syria. It doesn't matter. Why? Why does this brisa hold? This Tana hold that it could be brought from Chutz La'aretz? Kesaver chadash b'Chutz La'aretz d'oraisa. This brisa, this Tana, Rav Yosi bar Yehuda believes that the obligation of chadash in Chutz La'aretz is d'oraisa. It's a big shaila in the Tanoim of whether chadash in Chutz La'aretz is d'oraisa or d'Rabbanon. Right? Most Shitas actually hold that it's a chiv deraisa, which is why, like my Rosh Hashivas, they're makel on chol of stam. They for their family, they would allow their kids to have non chol Yisrael, but chadash they were very makbid on. Why? Because they said everyone's so funny because nobody's really makbid on chadash anymore. But chol Yisrael, everyone's super makbid. He's a chol Yisrael is derabanan. Chadash is a din deraisa. So. Okay, again, by the way, you should just know. Agav, the reason why we're makel nowadays in chadash, most people. It's not because it was difficult to get. That's I don't think that's true. The reason is because if you look in the Baal Shem Tov al Torah, I think it's in Parshas Bahar. He brings down that he saw in Shemayim there's a heter of the Bach in Chadash and Yashan to eat Chadash, and he said he saw in Shemayim the tumult when the Bach gave the heter, and he said if you would see that heter, you would realize that you could rely on it, and that's what Hasidim were always makel, and most people are Hasidim. So says the Gemara. I'm saying most Yidden are definitely affected by Hasidim outside of Sfardim. My bad. A Kesavar Chadash b'Chutz La'aretz d'oraisa. The Gemara says that this Tana believes that Chadash in Chutz La'aretz is a chiv d'oraisa. Tichsiv Mosh V'Seichem. Kol Makam Shatu Yosh V'Mashma. Mosh V'Seichem doesn't just mean Eretz Yisrael, means anywhere. V'chi Savayu Zman Biyahi. And Savayu just means that you're only obligated to bring the Omer when you enter Eretz Yisrael. V'kivan d'oraisa Yikruvin Nami Yikruvin. Makes sense. The whole point of the Omer is to be matir Chadash. If you believe that Chadash is the same in America as it is in Eretz Yisrael, then why can't I bring the grain from America? That's what this Tana believes. You could bring the grain of the Omer from Chutz La'aretz because he holds the chiv of Chadash is the same as the Raisa, Chutz La'aretz, or Eretz Yisrael. There's no reason to make a distinction. Tanan Hasam, the Mishnah says the following halacha. Okay, so they would bring the carbon Omer from barley on Pesach to be matir Chadash, and they would bring the wheat on the Shtei Halechem to be matir carbonus of Chadash. That was the halacha. So Omer is Pesach and barley, Shtei Halechem is Shavuos and it's wheat. These are karbanos. So generally, obviously, the Beis Hamikdash has to make sure that there's grain available. Now, generally, that's not an issue. The problem is Shemitah. You can't plant Shemitah, right? So how do they get grain to bring the carbon and you have to have chadash, by the way. You can't bring last year's. It's not like you can go from last year's silo. You need fresh grain for chadash, for the oimer and the shtei halechem. So you can't plant Shemitah. So what do you have to do? Shemitah just grows on its own, right? Sometimes it's called sapichim. It just grows on its own. So you find a patch that grows on its own, which I'm sure was very common, and you use that. Here's the problem though. Shemitah is hefker for everybody. So how do you make sure that they're still going to be available for the Beis HaMikdash? So the answer is, says the Mishnah, shoymrei spichen b'mishvius. They would set up shoymrim who would stand there by the sapichin that grew on their own, and they would guard to make sure that there was barley available for Pesach and there was wheat available for Shavuos. They would sit there and guard. And says the Mishnah, they were actually paid for by the Machzah Shekel from the Beis HaMikdash, meaning they would take Beis HaMikdash would pay from the Machzah Shekel funds to pay these shomrim. Okay, that's what the Mishnah says. Now it makes a lot of sense. They have to have barley, they have to have wheat. You can't use last year's grain because we just got finished saying it's got to be chadash. You can't plant. The only thing you rely on is aftergrowth. And the problem with aftergrowth is that people could just grab it, so they would set up shomrim. So the Gemara just speaks out why they had to do this. So the Gemara is, well, chutz la'aretz, not for shtei halechem. That was only for the oimer, and even that's debated by everybody. You're right. If you tack a hold that you can go with the oimer from chutz la'aretz, you're right. Then you don't have to do this. I think most Tanaim don't hold that way, and also doesn't help for the shtei halechem. So it says the Gemara, Rami bar Chama la Rav Chizda. Rami bar Chama says, why are you allowed to do this b'chalal? Tanan, it says in the Mishnah, Shomer Smichim b'Shviyas Noitlin Schar Mitrumas Halishka. We just got finished saying that. Or many have a contradiction. La'achla. So what would they do? They would watch this Shemitah grain. They would gather it and bring it as the karban oimer and the shtei halechem. Let me ask you a question. Isn't it la'achla v'loy l'sreifa? Isn't Shemitah meant to be eaten, not burnt? So you have to give a kmitza of this. If it's a kmitza, if it was burnt on the mizbech, how are you allowed to use Shemitah grain as a karban? I thought Shemitah is meant to be eaten, not burnt. And it's a strange question because it's like, well, it's for God. I'm saying it's not burnt like as fuel. So it says the Gemara, how are you allowed to use Shemitah grain for the karban if it's gonna be burnt? It's not gonna be entirely consumed. I thought the whole point of Shemitah is that it's eaten. So says the Gemara, Amar Lei. So Rami bar Chama responded. Rav Chizda said to Rami bar Chama, Rachmana Amar l'chol d'ariseichem v'at Amar tibatel. The Torah says there's a carbon. What would you like? The carbon to not exist? The only way to bring this carbon during Shemitah is from new grain, which by definition means you're going to burn. So you're going to say, how are you not allowed to? So what would you rather? No oimer, no shtei halechem? So he responds, Amar Lei, mi kamina nati batal. I'm not saying to cancel the carbon. Laisi mi jishtakin. Bring last year's grain. Now, by the way, meaning don't bring Shemitah grain. Bring last year's grain from the silos. Now, here's the problem, by the way. The Mefarshim are bothered by this. You can't bring Yashan. And by the way, even the Shitas from yesterday, the Brisa from yesterday, it's definitely b'di'evet. It's definitely not l'chachilas. It's a pella. But the Gemara is saying, I never said to not get rid of the karbanos. I'm saying don't use Shemitah grain. During Shemitah, use last year's grain. Says the Gemara, bi'inan karmel. Karmel means soft. The grain has to be soft, i.e. fresh. Veleka. So if I use last year's grain, it's not soft. Says the Gemara, Velaisi mekarmer d'shtakin. It was soft last year. It was soft once, right? It's 5 o'clock somewhere. It was soft sometime, right? So why not? Bring last year's grain. It was soft at some point. Amakra caramel takriv. No, it has to be soft b'shas hakrava. Be'inan caramel b'shas hakrava. Meaning he thought maybe it just means soft. It's just that it was harvested soft, even though now it's obviously a year older, so it's dry. No. Caramel takriv. It has to be caramel b'shas hakrava. Good. So it's interesting. So Itmar, the Gemara says, Rav Yechon Amar, what is the source that you can't use Yashan for these karbanos? So Rav Yochanan says, Karmel Takriv, the source that you can't use last year's grain is not just because Chadash and Yashan. Meaning, if I were to ask you, why is it that I have to use Chadash for Shnei Alechem in the Omer, you would just say, probably Svara-wise, they're Matir Chadash. So it makes sense that they should be Chadash. Rav Yochanan says, no, that's not Svara. It's Karmel. Karmel means that it has to be soft when you're bringing it, which by definition means it has to be chadash, because if it was old, it's not soft anymore. That's Rav Yochanan's take. Now, the reason why it's a little bit strange is because, I don't know if you're like holding in the psukim, we've had this concept a little bit before, and always the approach of why it has to be chadash is always from the words bikurim. Bikurim means new. And Rav Yochanan is now saying that it's not from there at all, it's from Carmel, which is just a little strange. So Rav Eliezer says, no, Reishis Kitzirchem. It says Reishis. It's called bikurim, and I think the shtei alechem are called bikurim, and the omer is called reishis. It has nothing to do with caramel. Caramel is different because you could argue caramel just means that it has to be soft when it's harvested. No, reishis, it's the first of the chadash. It's the first. Reishis kitzirchem loisav kitzirecha. So that's where Rav Elazar disagrees. So let me explain what we're about to do. We have a long brisa. This brisa is going to explain. We've had this brisa before, but let me explain what the brisa is doing. If you do Shnai Mikra, I think from Parshas Vayikra or Tzav. It's been a while. It's been a crazy week. Tzav, maybe? Vayikra? I don't know. I think Vayikra. It doesn't matter. Point is, it matters. I'm an idiot. But the point is, the parsha about Omer, the Torah never says Omer. If you were to read the Psukim, you would have no indication it's the Omer. It just says when you bring grain. Zero source in the Torah that is Omer. Rashi says, B'Omer HaKasam Medaber. Okay. So how did Rashi know this? It says this Gemara. This Gemara is going to take a pasuk and it's going to explain how we know we're dealing with the Omer. And one of the sources is because, and how, by the way, not just how you know dealing with the Omer. So there's a pasuk that says when you bring barley. So I'll just say outside and then we'll see it inside. Rav Akiva says, I know it's barley, I'll tell you why. Because the shtei alechem on Shavuos is called reishis. It's called the first of the bikurim. It's the first of the wheat. And if the Omer, which is brought 2 months prior, is also wheat, then the Shtei Alechem is no longer first. So that's how I know that the Omer is talking about barley, and the Shtei Alechem is therefore the first wheat, and the Omer is the first barley. The point is, from this brisa, it's going to be clear that the word that they're dealing with is bikurim, is reishis, and it's not like Rav Yochanan who says it has to do with caramel. It has nothing to do with caramel. The terms that are flowing around from this brisa is bikurim, is reishis, and that's more of a raya to Rav Eliezer. Says the Gemara, Moisiv Rav Rav Asakasha, the Torah says like this, V'im takriv, it's Vayikra. V'im takriv minchas bikurim, and it says, and when you offer the mincha of your first grain. So anyway, so it says the Gemara, if you bring the minchas bikurim, what is this talking about? Which carbon is this? It says the Gemara, the minchas ha'omer akasam medaber. It's talking about the omer. How do I know it's talking about the omer? Now, mehechan hiba, and where does this mincha come from? And this is talking about the omer. Okay, so what material was this come from? Min ha'sa'orim. It's come from barley. Ata omer min ha'sa'orim ela min achitin. How do you know it's barley? Maybe the omer is brought from wheat. So this is the shaila. How do I know that this pasuk, which is talking about the omer, indicates barley? So there's two different opinions. Rav Eliezer omer nemar aviv b'mitzrayim. It says the word aviv regarding makas barad. V'nemar aviv l'dairis, and it says the word aviv regarding the omer. So just like barad, the pasuk says it destroyed the barley grain. So to the omer, which has the same word, is also made of barley. That's the first source that the omer came from barley. Good. That's not why it's quoted over here. Let's keep going. Rav Akiva says, I'll tell you how I know that it's barley. Because we have a tradition. We know the following. We have a tradition that a yachid is able to bring, well, some of this is from Sukkim, but we have a tradition that each carbon is represented. We have an individual brings an obligatory mincha from wheat. Umebi chavasa min asarim, and he brings his mincha from barley, right? The standard, minchas chayte is from saita comes from barley, but the standard mincha is from wheat. So you have an individual wheat, individual barley. Af tzivar mevi chavasa min achitin, and we have a obligation of the tzivar from wheat. Umebi chavasa min asarim, and therefore it makes sense, meaning, if you fill in the boxes, you have individual wheat, check, individual barley, check, tzibar wheat, shtei alechem, check, and then you're looking, doesn't it make sense that tzibar would have barley? So with the omer must be barley, check. That's the Rav Akiva, it's more of a svara. And if you argue that the omer is from wheat, that we don't have that category checked off. Okay. But now comes Rav Akiva with a second shot, and this is why it's quoted. Davar acher, another mahalach, imata omer ba min achitin. If you argue that the omer comes from wheat, ein shtei alechem bikurim. The whole point is that the shtei alechem is called bikurim. It's the first, meaning it's the first wheat carbon. And if the omer 2 months prior is also wheat, then the shtei alechem is no longer first. So it must be the omer is the first barley, and the shtei alechem is the first wheat. What do you see? You see that how do I know that it's supposed to be first? It's because of the word bikurim. Not like Rav Yochanan said that Carmel Takriv. You see that it's a different lashon. It's bikurim, it's rashis. Says the Gemara, Alma mishom bikurim hu. It must be because it's the first. That's why, meaning, so you're looking for the word first, not softness of Carmel. So tiyufta. It's a rejection of Yochanan. Okay, Tanan Hasam. Now, ein mavim bikurim chutz mishivas haminim. The bikurim, which is the mitzvah when a farmer has new fruit, he brings it to the Beis Hamikdash and he gives it to the Kohen. Now, a couple of things. The reason why we quote Bikurim is one of the halachas is interesting, is that you cannot bring Bikurim until the Shtei Alechem is brought. What the Shtei Alechem does, as we're going to see in Amid Beis, the Shtei Alechem does is it's mater all karbanos of Chadash, meaning, if I want to bring an individual mincha between Pesach and Shavuos, I cannot bring Chadash. Even though I could eat Chadash in my house after Pesach, I cannot bring a Chadash carbon until Shavuos. Shavuos is Mater Chadash as karbanos. It's also Mater Nisachim. If I want to donate wine as a wine libation, I can't bring new wine until Shavuos. And thirdly, it's Mater Bikurim. You can't bring Bikurim until Shavuos. Shavuos is when Bikurim is now allowed to be brought. You could bring maybe last year's new fruits, but this year's new fruits are not brought until Shavuos. So it says the Gemara, what material is Bikurim brought up? Do you bring your first pear? Do you bring your first mango? So it says the Gemara, Ein mevi Bikurim chutz b'shivas haminim. It has to be the shivas haminim. Go to the next page. Now, v'loi mitzmorim shebaharim, although you bring it from the shivas haminim, let's say you have dates that are from the mountains. They're apparently very, very low quality dates. Or grain from the valley. Grain from the valley and dates from the mountains are not brought as bikurim. It has to be the standard good grain and good shivas haminim. If you have a species of the shivas haminim that are grown in specific areas that are subpar, not just that tree is a subpar tree, just that where it's being harvested, it's a subpar quality, it's not brought. Okay. Amar Ula adds, Imhevi like Kiddush. If you bring any of these disqualified products as Bikurim, it doesn't work. Meaning, it's not like B'di'evid, it's Bikurim. It's not Bikurim B'chlal. It's not effective. Okay. Yosef Rava Karmel HaShmaita, Eser Vacha Bar Abba L'Rava. L'Rabba. Okay. So, what we're going to do, I'm going to just say it outside what we're going to do, and we'll see it inside. It's a very long brisa describing what the Shtei Alechem is mater, how it's mater, the first carbon of wheat, the first carbon of barley, it's mater, blah, blah, blah. It goes through the whole thing. Then at some point the brisa is going to say, when it's describing Bikurim, it describes that you bring Bikurim from crops that are grown on a roof, in a churva, in a flower pot, or on a boat. That's one of the lines in this very long brisa. And the kasha is going to be, you just got finished telling me you can't bring it from palm trees that are grown in the mountains because it's subpar quality. So you're telling me that guy who's growing palm trees on a boat or in a roof or in a ruin, it's definitely not better quality. So it's a shaila on what you just got finished saying. Okay, it's a very long brisa. The brisa says like this. Carbon rashis. Regarding the Shtei Alechem, it says it's the first fruit carbon. Shetei rashis l'chol minchas. That means that it's the first carbon that's brought from the new crop of the new wheat. V'chein oimer ba'akrivchem mincha chadasha la'Hashem b'shuvo yiseichem. Ein li'el chadasha shalachitim. Again, before the Shtei Alechem, you are not allowed to bring any carbon that is new. So that's one pasuk. I only know that you can't bring new wheat. What if you're a saita and you want to bring new barley before Shavuos? Chadasha shel sarim minayin tam lemer chadasha chadasha. It says it twice. One is to tell me that you can't bring new wheat, and one is to tell me you can't bring new barley. So the omer is the only exception to that. That's the omer is mater chadash in Eretz Yisrael. But outside of the omer, before the Shtei Alechem, no individual is able to bring barley carbon. So we've mater, the Shtei Alechem is mater, new carbonos of wheat and new carbonos of barley. And how do I know that you can't bring bikurim before Shtei Alechem? It says the Yom Tov of Shavuos is now the first bikurim. It's implying you only bring bikurim on Shavuos, not before. Now this pasuk, it says bikurik tzir chitim. Now bikurim is the shivas haminim. So we've already mentioned that you can't bring the wheat of Bikurim before Shavuos. And how do I know that you don't bring the Bikurim of Sa'orim? You don't bring Bikurim if you're a barley farmer, because the pasuk says you have to wait for the Shtei Alechem to bring wheat. How do I know that you have to wait for the Shtei Alechem to bring Sa'orim as well? That's include barley. Now, it's to include barley, but it says tizra basada. Tizra means that you plant in the normal way. Tizra, I only know that you have to wait for Shavuos if you plant in the normal way. What if you're a farmer and you're a barley farmer and you have new barley and you want to show up before Shavuos and you ask me and I say, no, you got to wait. It says you got to wait. And you say, where does it say you have to wait? It says tizra basada. You have to wait for Shavuos. Tizra basada. You say to respond, you're clever, and you say tizra means you planted. I didn't plant it. It grew on its own. What if the wind blew the seeds and it grew on its own? So I want to bring Bikurim and I didn't plant it. It grew on its own. Tamalemer basada. Basada means however it grew, you have to wait for Shavuos. This is the key. I only know that the Shtei Alechem is matir Bikurim for crops that are grown in the field. How do I know that you have to wait for Shavuos to bring the Bikurim that were grown on a roof, in a churv and a ruin, in a flower pot or on a boat? Now the kasha is, you just got finished telling me that you don't bring bikurim of subpar qualities. I can't imagine things that are grown on a roof are great quality. And how do I know? Now we just have to finish the brisa before we address the question. How do I know that the Shtei Alechem is also needed to be matir nesachim and peres ilan? Peres ilan means the other shivas aminim, the fruit. Pomegranates, and also nesachim, that if I want to bring a wine libation to the Beis Hamikdash, I have to wait for Shavuos to bring new wine. Nemar kan bekurim masecha, v'nemar lon ba'aschavas masechem menasadem, alon nesachim peres ilan, afkan nesachim peres ilan. Oh, so what's the kasha of this brisa? Katani miyas shebegag v'shebechur v'sheba'atzis shebenak v'shebesvina. So you see, the brisa specifically says that the Shtei Alechem is matir those crops that are grown in that, and we're talking about bikurim. So you see that bikurim applies even on subpar fruit, as long as they're part of the proper species. So the Gemara says no. You have to. I'll just sort of say this outside. There was a shift. Although the pasuk is talking about bikurim, this line of the brisa that the pasuk says basada, and how do I know that it's to include Shebegag, v'shebechurba, v'she'atzis, v'shebesvina, b'kurei kol asher ba'artzam is actually not talking about bikurim anymore. B'kurei kol asher ba'artzam is actually talking about the minchas. Meaning, if it's taka fruit, te'ena chita, te'ena, what do you call it, pomegranate, shemen zayis, all that stuff does not apply because it's subpar qualities. So it's so what's the pasuk talking about? It's talking about minchas. Back to the original point, the Shtei Alechem is matir, new grain for the mincha. So Elisha shows up, he wants to bring a carbon nidava of lechem, and I say, is it new? And he said, yeah. I said, gotta wait for the Shtei Alechem. And he says, yeah, no, but I grew this on a boat. Or he's growing its stuff on his roof again, which we talked about, right? So the point is, he's growing it on a boat, whatever. So the answer is, that's what the pasuk's talking about. Meaning, it's not talking about bikurim. We thought it was talking about bikurim. The answer is no, bikurim are potter because it's subpar quality. This pasuk now, within the pasuk itself, it shifted. It went from bikurim, it's now back to the karban mincha. Okay. Says the Gemara, Sefer Nasan Menachos. Now here's the issue. Maskele Ravada Barava Ihachi Wemes. He telling me this part of the pasuk is talking about the mincha again. We thought it was talking about bikurim. Now it's going back to mincha. Here's the problem. What does the pasuk say? Kol tahar bebeisecha yochaloso. Kol tahar bebeisecha means that you give it to the kohen. And who eats it in the kohen's house? Could he share it with his daughter, with his wife, with his slaves? Kol tahar also. Anyone in the house. Now let me ask you a question. If we're talking about bikurim, perfect. The kohen is allowed to share pomegranates with his daughter and with his. That's perfect. But now you're telling me no. This pasuk now shifted back to the menachos. Menachos are kachei kachim. They must be eaten by male kohanim only. So now within that pasuk itself, which I thought we were talking about bikurim, you say no, it's talking about mincha. But the end of the pasuk is definitely talking about bikurim, because the end of the pasuk is telling me who gets to eat it. And it says any member of the kohanim family. And if it's talking about minchas, like you're thinking it is, minchas must be eaten by male kohanim. Says the Gemara, "V'ibim menachos l'sicher kuna de misavlin." Amra Mishashia trei kroiksiv lo yiyah uksiv kol tarbe yisachayoso haketzad kam bikurim kam menachos. The answer is, it shifted back. Meaning, you're right. This pasuk starts off talking about Bikurim. Then, those words, it goes to a mincha. Then the end of the pasuk shifts back to Bikurim. So when the pasuk says, Kol tahar beveisecha yochalo so, that's talking about Bikurim. It shifted, it's ping-ponging back and forth within one pasuk itself. Rav Ashi says, I'll give you another answer. Rav Ashi says, I think the whole thing's talking about a mincha. So you say to yourself, well, wait, if it's a mincha, the pasuk says that it could be eaten by any member of the Kahanim family. I thought the minchas have to be eaten by male Kahanim. The answer is, there's two minchas. There's one mincha that could be eaten by any one of the Kahanas family, and that's the lachmei toda. Right? You show up with a toda, you show up with 40 loaves, you give 4 to the kohen. That's technically a mincha that could be eaten by his wives, because it's considered kachikalim. So that's what the pasuk is talking about. The pasuk is really talking about a mincha. So why, if it's talking about mincha, why does it say anyone in the family could eat it? It's talking about lachmei toda. Okay. Rav Ashi says, kula b'menachos v'sefer tekra'asan lalachmei toda. Okay. So we had before a machlokes, a shaila, if you have subpar quality bikurim, it's potter. The question is, if you brought it, is it kadosh? So Ula said no. Says the Gemara beplukta. The truth is, it's a machlokes. Rav Yechanan Amar Hevi loy kadosh. Rish Lakish Amar Hevi kadosh. Rish Lakish disagrees. Rish Lakish says, while you're potter from bikurim, if you brought it, b'diavad it's kadosh. Why? Because nasik yikachush shebekodshim. Sometimes you have weak animals, meaning you're supposed to bring an animal that's strong, and let's say you show up, you're poor, and you have a shvacha animal. It works, right? But the evidence works. So says Rish Lakish, you show up to the Beis Hamikdash with bikurim that are grown in a mountain. It's a shvacha bikurim. It works, but the evidence. That's Rish Lakish's shita. Bishlam Rish Lakish kadamar taima. El Rav Yochanan on my time. What's Rav Yochanan's source that it's not kaddish at all? So the answer is Rav Elazar. Rav Yochanan chaze b'chaloim. Rav Elazar says, I saw Rav Yochanan in a dream, which means that it was a good sign that I'm going to be able to be masber his Torah. What did I see in a dream? He says, Milsa malaisa minis. I'm going to tell you a good verse, because if in fact I saw him in a dream, it was a good omen. Omar kra mereshis v'loy kol reshis me artzecha v'loy kol artzecha. The pasuk implies that there are some bikurim that are potter. It says me reshis, not kol reshis, not all first fruits. Some are exempt, and may artzecha v'loy kol artzecha. Some are exempt, and what is that referring to? That's referring to the shvacha quality. Rish Lakish may artzecha may avidle. What does Rish Lakish do with the word may artzecha? Because he already says that it taka works. So what is that excluding? Miboyle look at the Tanya. Rav Gamliel Rabbi Omer nemar kan eretz nemar lon eretz malon shevach eretz av kan shevach eretz. He says, you know what my artzecha is telling me? Not that if it's subpar quality, it's potter. It's telling me what type of fruit is chayiv in the shivas haminim. Meaning, how do you know it's a shivas haminim? Maybe it's a star fruit. The answer is eretz. Which fruit are shevach, are praised to Eretz Yisrael, the shivas haminim? So therefore, it's dafka that. So he uses me'artzecha not to exclude shvach fruit, but to tell you what type of fruit is chayiv in bikurim. Let's just finish up. Let's get to the Mishnah. V'idach eretz me'eretz. And Rav Yochanan learns that out from the word extra mem. And idach eretz me'eretz l'mashal Rish Lakish doesn't darsh in the mem. Okay, just to finish up. Tani chada. So you have machlekes Rav Yochanan Rish Lakish if you have subpar quality, whether it's considered b'diavad, bikurim or not. Rav Yochanan says no. Rish Lakish says yes. Tani chada. One brisa says shebe gag, v'shebe churba, v'shebe otzitz, v'shebe svina, maybe v'koira. We know that when you would bring bikurim, you would say a special pasuk, a paragraph, a ramid aviravi, and you would have describe how I'm bringing the fruit of Eretz Yisrael, v'kulei. One brisa says that if you have crops that grew on a roof or in a ruin, in a flower pot, in a boat, you bring it and you say the psukim because it's full-fledged bikurim. And one brisa says you don't. So here's the kasha. Here's the problem. Rish Lakish, I could explain it, as we'll see in a moment, because Rish Lakish entertains the notion that you could have a subpar quality as bikurim. So for him, it's not so hard to understand. The Gemara says, Bishlamil Rish Lakish, I can answer each one. Gaga gaga kasha. Let's go with the roof. One brisa says that if I grew it on the roof, it's bikurim, and you read the pasuk. One says you don't read the pasuk. Hadegag demara, hadegag debayis. The brisa that says that you read it is where it grew on the roof of a cave. Apparently, the roof of a cave is regular land, so you read it. And the other one that says when you don't read it is where it grew on the roof of a house. Meaning, Yeah, because if a roof on a house, it's not considered me'artzecha. Meaning, both are bikurim, even though it's all sub-quality. I can't imagine growing on the roof of a house or on the roof of a cave is good quality. The answer is it's shvach quality either way. So why is it that one you read the pasuk, one you don't? Because in the paragraph of reading the pasuk, it says me'eretz. It says I brought it from the land. If it grew on a house, it's not me'eretz. But at least both are bikurim. This works out according to Reish Lakish. It says the Gemara Vayter, churva lekasha. This also could explain the churva. Kan bechurva avuda, kan bechurva she'ein avuda. The Bryson says that you read is where it grew in a churva that was cultivated, so it's considered growing in the normal way. But kan bechurva she'ein avuda. But if a churva that's not cultivated, that it's not considered growing in the normal way, therefore you don't read the pasuk. It's not considered the normal eretz. Otzitz like kasha, same thing with a flower pot. Kan benekuva, kan she'ein benekuva. In otzitz nokuv, that means it's perforated, it's considered growing from the ground, so you could read the pasuk. And if it's not perforated, you don't. And svina like kasha, kan besvina shel eitz, kan besvina shel cheres. If a svina shel cheres, it's considered, we look at it as like a giant flower pot. And therefore, if it's the svina of cheres, if it's resting on the silt of the ground, and it's cheres, then we look at it as if it's growing. But the wood is considered a hefsek. Correct. So because it's considered touching it and it's underwater, that's considered. So the point is, though, this is all saying that it works because this is Reish Lakish's shita. According to Rav Yochanan, you know what the answer is the entire thing? The answer is all of it is no good. It's not bikurim on any of it. Says the Gemara, El Rav Yochanan kasha. So the Rav Yochanan responds, Tanaihi. Rav Yochanan says, it's a machlekes Tanaim. I don't follow this brisa. I follow a different brisa. The Tanya, shebegag v'shebechurva maybe v'kora, shebe'otzes v'shebesina, eina maybe kolikar. This second line of the brisa is a different opinion. You don't read it at all. It's not bikurim. So Rav Yochanan says, I follow that last view. Let's just get to the Mishnah. We mentioned that the Menachos can be brought from anywhere in the world outside of Omer She'elechem, but it's brought from the choices of Eretz Yisrael. The Gemara, we mentioned a place called Afarim, because that's where a lot of grain and straw was from. Amri lo Yochanan umamri lo Moshe. Two of the Egyptian sorcerers, when they were dealing with Moshe was bringing Moifsim, when Moshe was doing, making a Moshe Rabbeinu, was taking the stick and turning into a snake. Two of the Egyptian sorcerers said to Moshe Rabbeinu, Teven atamachnis lafarim. You're bringing straw to Afarim, meaning you're trying to bring sorcery into Egypt. This is we do this here for a living, so I don't think it's a good idea. And by the way, the point of this is because it mentions straw and Afarim. So he responded, Moshe Rabbeinu responded, Amri inchi lemasa yarka shakel. So you know what Moshe Rabbeinu said? Where do you sell vegetables? At the vegetable market. Meaning, I'm going to a place that appreciates it, so you'll actually know that I'm not messing around. That was tough.